This is just gospel according to Janelle.
For years, Christine had been known as the heart of the family, the emotional center. She laughed the loudest, comforted the fastest, forgave the easiest. She had learned early that harmony was something you created and not something you waited for. She had learned how to soften conflict before it turned sharp, how to smile through disappointment, how to make peace feel normal even when it wasn't. A confidence that was never fully hers to own. Not for lack of it, but because the system around her didn't survive when she stood too firmly inside herself. She learned early to make herself smaller in ways nearly imperceptible. Smaller needs, smaller expectations, smaller boundaries. She made space for everyone else first, trusting that someday the room would naturally make space for her. That day never came. Instead, years passed, seasons changed, children grew up, and Christine's identity was slowly shaped by service rather than selfhood. Her worth measured not by who she was, but by how well she held everything together. And she did hold it together. Longer than anybody actually knew. But something inside her had begun to shift long before she ever said it aloud. Not loudly, not in rebellion, quietly. In the exhaustion, in the disappointment when no one noticed. In those moments when it was more explaining her pain rather than healing it. Confidence doesn't always arrive as boldness. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. Christine began to see her own unhappiness clearly for the first time. Not as a failure, not as something to endure, but as information. A signal that something fundamental was wrong. Clarity is dangerous inside systems built on endurance, because endurance depends on not looking too closely. Of course, once Christine looked closely, she could not unsee what she saw. She saw patterns where the others saw isolated incidents. She saw an imbalance instead of misunderstanding, control instead of leadership, and silence instead of peace. Most importantly, she saw herself, not just as a function, not just as a carer, but as a woman with unmet needs that no amount of patience could erase. That realization didn't initially make her angry. She was very sad because of that. While sadness, if held too long without a change in mind, becomes resolve. Christine's confidence didn't overnight explode into the family. In small, quiet ways, it emerged. She stopped over-explaining. She stopped apologizing preemptively. She stopped justifying why she felt what she felt. Those changes were subtle, but to a family accustomed to her emotional availability, they felt seismic. At first, they thought that she was simply tired. Then they thought she was going through a phase. Then they realized that something deeper was happening. Christine was no longer asking for permission to exist as herself. She was stepping into herself without asking, which disrupted the emotional order of the whole family. It does so because confidence performs one crucial function in the systems constructed based on that imbalance. It exposes it. The clearer Christine spoke to her own emotions, the more impossible it became for anyone else to act like they weren't there. The more calmly she stated her boundaries, the more it became apparent just how few she was ever allowed to have in the first place. The stronger she became in her voice, the louder the silence around everyone else became. And so, suddenly, the family found themselves face to face with something they had never dealt with for decades. Christine wasn't changing. She was emerging. And emergence is never convenient, because emergence is forcing everybody else to reassess their own position. Some were inspired by it. They saw courage in her clarity, strength in her refusal to shrink anymore, relief in finally watching someone choose themselves without apology. Others felt threatened, not because Christine attacked anyone, but because her confidence removed the excuse that staying small was the only way to survive. When one person stands up, all others must face the reasons they remain on their knees. Christine's confidence was not loud, it was steady, and steady confidence is far more disruptive than emotional outbursts. She was no longer seeking reassurance on the validity of her feelings. She treated them as valid by default. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was choosing herself. That single shift changed the emotional weight of the family completely. She would no longer serve as a shock absorber of pain in silence. One could no longer count on her keeping the peace instead of telling the truth. They could no longer make her happiness optional. And for the first time, the family felt what it was like to orbit around someone who was no longer emotionally bending. That doesn't feel like inspiration to begin with. It feels like instability. Because when balance has been built upon one person over-functioning emotionally, that balance collapses the moment they stop. Christine stopped. Not suddenly, decisively. And with every limit clear that she had set, the illusion of harmony which once held the family together cracked a little bit more. Her confidence forced conversations that had been avoided for years. It forced accountability where comfort once lived. It forced emotional honesty where denial once stood. And not everyone was ready for that. Some responded in disbelief. This isn't like her. Others with defensiveness. She's changing. Others with guilt cloaked as concern. Are you sure you're okay? But Christine didn't retreat. Because confidence, once rooted in truth, doesn't require defense. She was not disowning her past. She was simply no longer willing to live inside it. That made a difference. The family had grown comfortable with the version of Christine that made everything smoother. The version that carried emotional weight so no one else had to. The version that accepted disappointment quietly so stability could be preserved. But that version of Christine had all but vanished within that role. And now she was reclaiming herself. That reclamation shook the family, not because it was aggressive, but because it was irreversible. The power of Christine's confidence didn't come from confrontation. It came from consistency. She was firm in her boundaries. She is consistent in her tone. Consistent in choosing herself, even when it made others uncomfortable. That consistency made it impossible to dismiss her growth as a temporary mood or an emotional reaction. This wasn't impulsive. This was awakening. People around her started to behave differently, even when they couldn't quite explain why. Conversations softened. Tension remained. Some people started, for the first time, to question their emotional stance. Because Christine's confidence acted like a mirror. Not everyone liked what that reflected. Her children witnessed it. They saw a mother who wasn't apologizing for taking space anymore. They saw a happy woman untied without feeling guilty about her choices. They saw strength not that would dominate, yet neither did it disappear. That alone began to reshape generational expectations. Confidence is infectious when it is based on self-respect. And Christine's self-respect was finally apparent. But visibility comes with consequence. As her boundaries grew firmer, so the emotional distance between her and those who benefited from her old silence grew wider. Not through cruelty, through clarity. She was no longer available for emotional imbalance. She was available only for mutuality. And mutuality is seldom found in systems designed based on hierarchy. The family had to adjust. Some leaned into growth, others leaned into denial. But nobody could be blind to what was happening any longer. Christine's confidence was not an issue concerning her alone. It had become the catalyst shaking the whole emotional structure of the family. And that shaking had only just begun. As Christine's confidence became impossible to ignore, the emotional responses in the space around her began escalating. Not explosively, internally. In people who had grown accustomed to believing she would always yield first, the realization that she no longer would created an unfamiliar discomfort. Anger, not at first. Disorientation. Her emotional elasticity had been what the family had depended on for so long. She absorbed disappointment so others wouldn't have to. She softened words so truth wouldn't land too hard. She made space whenever space was needed, even when there was none left for herself. When that stopped, so did the emotional economy of the family. People felt it immediately. Suddenly, conversations seemed weightier. Tension remained where it used to disappear. And accountability appeared where it had once been fled from. And the silent assumption that Christine would always lighten the load no longer stood. Some family members reacted with confusion. They looked backwards for the version of her they knew. They assumed it was exhaustion or stress or temporary emotion that must be at play. Surely this steadiness would fade. Surely she would soften again. But she didn't. And the longer her confidence held, the harder it became to deny that something permanent had changed. For the first time, Christine wasn't managing her family's emotional weather. She wasn't forecasting storms and pre-aligning herself. She wasn't recasting her needs into a shape that would be more palatable for others. She let life respond to her now, which would be in reverse. That reversal alone was enough to unsettle the entire family dynamic. People who relied on her emotional flexibility now had to navigate discomfort without her cushioning it. They had to sit with reactions she once absorbed quietly. And sitting with discomfort exposes truth. Some of them were forced to confront how much they had leaned upon her without realizing it, how frequently her emotional labor had protected them from accountability to their own selves, how much her silence had spared them from conflict they should have faced long ago. That brought a realization of guilt. Not everybody took it so well. Some of them projected guilt outward, framing her confidence as selfishness. They questioned her motives, they reframed her growth as emotional abandonment. The narrative shifted, subtly at first. She's different now. She is just not the same. She's changed. As if change itself were a kind of treachery. But Christine did not dispute the narrative. She did not defend her evolution. She simply continued to be who she was becoming. And that was so much scarier than any speech could ever be. Others reacted differently. They watched her closely, not critically, but reflectively. Something in her courage spoke to them of a part of themselves that they had long buried. They saw now the cost of silence when someone finally stopped paying. They felt an ache with knowing they too once wanted to stand up for themselves, but fear had taught them to remain seated. Christine's confidence didn't accuse them. It invited them. An invitation is much more powerful than confrontation. But as the emotional temperature changed, long-avoided conversations could no longer be avoided. The boundaries Christine once enforced quietly now required negotiation because people could no longer act as if they did not exist. She no longer took assumptions as facts. She questioned what once had not been negotiable. She explained what had previously been assumed. And that clarity disrupted old scripts. People began to watch their words more closely around her. Some out of respect, others out of uncertainty. Others because they were trying to find a way around the boundaries instead of through them. But Christine's tone remained steady, not defensive, decisive. That steadiness forced others to decide how they would meet her, with growth or with resistance. The emotional fallout of her assuredness began to manifest in unforeseen ways. Interactions that once had been effortless now carried weight. Silences between conversations became heavier. The emotional predictability that had once characterized the family began to dissolve. That dissolution created space, and space always demands something new to fill it. Some filled it with introspection, others filled it with resentment, some with fear, some with quiet admiration. But now no one could fill it with denial anymore. Christine's confidence had eliminated that option. As her voice empowered, so did her presence. She no longer diffused conflict by shrinking. She did so by refusing to participate in imbalance. That didn't heighten the differences. It ended them before they could get started. For some, that felt like relief. For others, it was abandonment. Because when someone stops fighting for the dynamic you rely on, it can feel like losing them, even when what you're really losing is your access to their emotional labor. Christine knew that all too well. She provided space for people to feel whatever they needed to feel, but she didn't carry it for them. This was not the Christine they had known, and it was not the Christine she could ever be again. Her confidence was no longer situational. It had become structural, and structural change doesn't negotiate with nostalgia. In such a moment, the family reached an emotional transition period. Not complete chaos, not complete peace, just suspended in between where every interaction seemed to raise a new question. Who are we now that Christine no longer holds everything together for us? That question made people restless. Some felt exposed, others felt abandoned, some felt free. That exact same change does not land with the same heart. Christine felt those reactions without absorbing them. She had learned how to let emotion be there without taking responsibility for it all. That in and of itself marked how far she had already come. Her confidence was not loud. However, it was immovable. And immovable confidence forces everything around it to either align or break. As time passed, the family began to realize something uneasy. Christine's boundaries were not temporary measures. They were the foundation of a life she had already embarked upon. A life in which happiness wasn't postponed. A life where love was mutual and not conditional. A life in which dignity no longer depends on approval. That life was moving her along steadily, even when some relationships struggled to keep pace. Emotional tremors went on, not through shouting. Realignment. The family was being reshaped not by conflict, but by clarity. And clarity does not negotiate, it simply reveals. And what it was revealing now was this. Christine's confidence was not shaking the family because she was leaving. It shook the family because finally she had arrived, as herself. As Christine's confidence continued to settle into permanence, the family could no longer treat it as if it would pass. This was not exhaustion, nor emotion, nor reaction. This was transformation, and transformation never moves quietly through a system built upon old expectations. The emotional power shift was impossible to avoid. The family had been working for years with an unspoken hierarchy, not one declared openly, but in the reinforcement through habit. Some voices carried more weight, some discomforts were elevated over others. Some emotions could disrupt everything, while others were to be contained. She had lived at the bottom of that hierarchy, and for a long period of time had never named it. Now her confidence lifted her out of it without asking permission. She didn't demand power. She stopped giving it away. And it was the only change that rearranged every emotional relationship around her. Those who had once been certain found themselves stumped. Their words no longer landed the way they had. Their reactions no longer framed outcomes as easily. Where Christine had once softened truth to preserve peace, she was letting the truth exist without rescue. That alone felt like resistance, even though it wasn't framed as such. Some attempted to reinstate the old balance by using emotional blackmail. Subtle guilt, nostalgia, reminders of how things used to be, appeals for unity that sounded more like a request for compliance. But Christine didn't take the bait. She listened. She admitted. She would not budge. And that steadiness shook everything loose. Because emotional power only works if someone agrees to hold it for you. Christine was not holding it anymore. So everybody around her had to hold their own. That reality terrified some. They were not used to being responsible for their words, their reactions, their emotions without someone cushioning the blow. They had gotten used to Christine absorbing the discomfort. Now the discomfort came back unfiltered. Unfiltered discomfort demands accountability. Some responded by becoming quieter, not withdrawn, but careful. They measured their words more closely. They evaluated their intentions before speaking. They were learning that Christine would no longer translate their feelings into something more manageable. Others countered with defensiveness. They tried to make her confidence a lack of caring. They said she was pulling away, that she was changing too much, that she'd become cold. But confidence often feels cold to people who were warmed by someone else's sacrifice. Christine felt those accusations without internalizing them. She no longer needed external confirmation to trust her inner compass. That was the new power. The emotional fractures widened subtly, not through blow-ups, but through distance. Conversations became shorter with some people, more intentional with others. The family started sorting itself without ever explicitly saying so. Relationships based on mutual respect, not emotional duty. And where there was no respect, there was simply space, not punishment. Distance. Distance is what occurs when there is no longer alignment. Some tried to renegotiate the old terms of the relationships. They came to Christine with softened voices, speaking in conditional understanding. They moved toward her halfway, so long as halfway didn't require them to change too much. Christine knew that instinct straight away. She didn't shame it. She did not accept it. She realized that half measures were a just, preservative attempt on comfort, not to restore the balance. Balance was no more available under the old contract. And an uncomfortable truth began to sink in for the family. They had never adjusted when Christine needed them to change. Now they were being asked, wordlessly, to make an adjustment for her. That reversal was jarring. Because asking people to change for someone they once took for granted is forcing them to face how much they benefited from things staying the same. Christine wasn't looking to avenge that imbalance. She refused to tend to it. While refusal is often more threatening than retaliation, there was a divide between those who would grow with her emotionally, apparent and becoming more visible by the day, while others wished she would revert back to the way things used to be. Christine sensed that divide without needing to name it. She adjusted her energy accordingly. She leaned into the spaces that felt mutual. She loosened the grip on spaces that felt conditional. And for the first time, she let some relationships go quiet and did not try to renew them. That was a new confidence. Not the confidence that proves it, a confidence that permits. She allowed relationships to grow. She let them fade. She allowed herself not to pursue either outcome. And that permission further altered the emotional landscape. The people who stayed in close proximity to her started seeing another Christine. One not molded by accommodation, but one molded by presence. She laughed more freely. She spoke with less hesitation. She didn't flinch under tension. She was still warm, but she was no longer pliable. That combination, warmth with immovability, is what really destabilized the old structures of power. For pliability had been mistaken for kindness. And now there was kindness that never varied, which means nobody was able to force their way through anymore. In the process, Christine's confidence started to impact others in ways she never meant but could not control. It was the quiet people who resided inside their frustration who started to question their emotional positions. They would watch her choose determinants without apology and feel something stir inside. Not jealousy, recognition. They recognized how many times they had silenced themselves, how often they had chosen peace that cost them dignity, how deeply they had learned to make their pain small. Christine's growth became an unspoken challenge. If she can change, what does that mean about me? Not everyone was ready to answer that question. Some resisted it. Some ignored it. Some leaned into it slow and gracefully. But the question wouldn't have existed as such now. And questions, once planted, grow. As the emotional aftermath continued to unravel, the family dynamic shifted into the unknown. It no longer defined Christine holding everything together from the margins. It was now defined by whether the family could meet her at the center with mutuality instead of expectation. That challenge exposed which relationships had real foundations and which were built upon convenience. The emotional burden that Christine had been carrying by herself began to shift. Some of them picked it up rather willingly. Others dropped it altogether. But it no longer defaulted to her. And that was the greatest shift of all. Christine was no longer defined by how much she could endure. She defined herself by how fully she could live. That redefinition fractured old narratives, not with noise, with permanence. It no longer was about Christine ever going back to normal. This was about whether everyone else could accept that normal had changed. And acceptance doesn't come on command. It comes through necessity. The family was now nearing that necessity. The emotional compromise that once held everything together was gone. What was left was truth. And truth, when unveiled, does not carry with it the solace of illusion. It requires decision-making. By the time Christine's confidence had fully settled into who she was, the family no longer had the luxury of interpreting it as temporary. This was no longer a season of emotional awakening. This was a permanent shift in how power moved through their lives. And with permanence comes consequence. Irreversible consequence. Christine's choices were no longer reactive. They were proactive. She wasn't responding to pressure anymore. She was shaping her future with intention. And that intention forced everyone around her to confront a reality they had long avoided. The system that once rotated on emotional hierarchy could not exist with her self-directed life. Something had to give. For years, the family had used familiarity to avoid decision. Routine was a shield. Tradition was an excuse. They told themselves that change was too disruptive, too risky, too painful. Christine's confidence removed that excuse without ever accusing anyone of using it. Her life just moved on, and forward motion is impossible to ignore. The emotional distance between her and those parts of the family still clinging to the old dynamic naturally grew wider, not as a punishment, but due to incompatibility. Their rhythms no longer fit. Their priorities are no longer congruent. Their emotional language no longer speaks the same truth. She was speaking for self-respect now. Some were even speaking still in control. Those two languages cannot coexist for long without one dissolving. Christine started declining conversations that once would have consumed her entire emotional energy, not because she didn't care, but because she no longer wanted to exchange clarity for chaos. She no longer wanted to relitigate pain as a form of connection. She wanted peace to be the baseline, not the reward after endurance. That wall that was enforced on others made them feel what she alone had felt for years. What she silently absorbed previously now echoed back through the family. To some, that echo was not bearable. They sought to drag her back into the emotional center that they once occupied together, through nostalgia, through guilt, through the judicious use of reminders of old loyalties, through fear of permanence. But Christine never came back, because going back now would be to destroy her own healing, and she would not do that again. Her children watched all this with eyes that saw from a different vantage from the adults. They didn't see conflict, they saw transformation. They saw a mom no longer worn down at the edges, a woman choosing happiness overtly rather than bartering for it in secret. That was important because the visibility mattered. It reframed everything they had learned about love, endurance, and self-worth. They were witnessing in real time that choosing yourself doesn't mean abandoning your family, it means modeling truth for them. That alone made Christine's confidence more powerful than anyone had anticipated. Within the extended family, lines continued to be drawn, not with animosity, with clarity. People chose where they stood emotionally by how they responded to her growth. Some met her with respect, even if it was uncomfortable. Others remained rooted in denial, hoping the shift would eventually soften or reverse. But emotional reversals don't happen once identity is reclaimed. And then Christine's life outside the old structure started to take visible shape. New routines, new priorities, new anchors of stability that had nothing to do with approval or negotiation. Her vocabulary changed, her energy changed, even the way she inhabited space changed. She no longer asked if she belonged. She thought of it as first within herself. That assumption changed every encounter. People now had a choice in how they were going to relate to a woman who no longer looked to the roles for validation of who she was. They could meet her as an equal or drift into the background of her past. That decision confronted everyone differently. Some felt liberated by it. Others felt abandoned by it. What they actually were losing wasn't Christine. They were losing the version of her that endured instead of living. And losing that version felt like losing control, which, in fact, it was. The family dynamic entered a phase of pressure, not explosive, converging. Every emotional contract that had gone unresolved started to demand resolution. Conversations that previously could have been postponed now needed to be addressed or shed completely. Christine no longer negotiated those contracts, she let them expire. That expiration forced others to decide whether they would rewrite them on new terms or let them die. Some relationships may rewrite. Assumption was replaced with mutual respect. Emotional bargaining was replaced with honest conversation. Those connections deepened in ways the old structure never allowed. Other relationships may not overwrite. They resisted equality. They resisted the loss of emotional dominance. They clung to the belief that hierarchy was needed for unity. Those relationships drifted. Not with hatred, with sadness. Christine grieved them in private. She in no way pretended that the loss did not hurt. But she also did not pursue what needed her to abandon herself. That was the final proof of how far she had come. Before them was a tipping point, not marked so much by an event, but by decisions accumulated. Decisions to respect boundaries, decisions to ignore boundaries, decisions to grow, decisions to resist. The consequences of those decisions were now inevitable. Christine's confidence was no longer shaking the family in theory. It was reshaping their future in practice. And futures, once shifted, do not curve back into old molds. Gone was the emotional system that once relied on her silence. What would follow depended on what each individual chose to build in its place. That question hung in the space between every conversation now. Would they grow with her, or to remain anchored to what no longer existed? The answer was no longer potential. It was already unfolding. By the time the dust began to settle, the family could no longer pretend that Christine's confidence was just a phase they would eventually outlast. It was woven into who she had become. And because it was rooted in self-respect instead of reaction, it was unmovable. The shaking had stopped. In other words, the transformation had started. For the first time in a very long time, Christine was not waiting for anyone to meet her halfway. She was already walking forward. That forward motion quietly decided everything. Some relationships followed, others didn't. The divide was no longer about loyalty versus rebellion. It was about alignment versus resistance. And alignment doesn't respond to pressure, it responds to truth. Christine's truth had become steady, predictable, not in its content, but in its integrity. People could now trust that what she said was what she meant, that if she said yes, it was real. If she said no, it was final. If she stayed, it was by choice. If she stepped back, it was without malice. That sort of emotional dependability changes everything. They stopped guessing what mood she would be in. They stopped bracing for emotional fallout. They stopped assuming that she would absorb what they did not want to face. The uncertainty that once surrounded her reactions disappeared. She had become more emotionally grounded. And grounded people do not revolve around unstable centers. They become centers. Christine's presence began operating as a stabilizing force instead of a compensating one. Instead of patching emotional leaks, she was now modeling what emotional health actually looked like. And that revelation exposed how unhealthy the old normal truly had been. Some family members, because of it, quietly rewired their whole relationship mode. They tried therapy, they looked at their boundaries, they recast how they communicated and how they handled conflict, and how they expressed need. Not because Christine insisted on a divorce, but because her life proved it was possible. Others took longer. They watched her move forward without their permission. They felt the sting of irrelevance where authority once lived. They grappled with regret that they didn't know how to name. They realized that control had cost them access, not just to Christine, but to the version of connection they once took for granted. Coming to that realization perhaps is one of the toughest truths anyone can face, because it means acknowledging that what you tried to preserve is the very thing that pushed people away. Christine never made that accusation. She didn't have to. Time said it for her. The weeks passed, then the months. Her confidence didn't soften with time. It deepened. She developed routines reflecting of peace, not recovery. She laughed without scanning the room for tension. She made plans without emotional negotiations attached. She spoke about her future without hesitation. She did not speak about survival anymore. She spoke about life. And the family, watching from various distances, felt the full weight of what had changed. Some accepted it, some mourned it, some tried to reinterpret it, but none could undo it. Christine no longer shook the family with her confidence. It had redefined it. Gone was the old emotional structure that depended on her endurance. In its place stood a new reality, one based upon differentiated relationships, chosen connections, and